When it comes to George Washington's presidency, you need to know that he set a bunch of precedents for the future presidents. He had a 2-term limit. In addition, he had a set of advisors known as a cabinet. One cabinet member you should know about is Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury. He wanted to stabilize the economy by having a national bank. In addition, he wanted to pay up all debt so that people would take the United States seriously abroad. George Washington fought back the Whiskey Rebellion. Unlike Shays' Rebellion, which got out of control, the Whiskey Rebellion was put down rather peacefully because the commander-in-chief, with the backing of the new Constitution that had an army, got rid of that insurrection rather quickly. George Washington would leave office with the farewell address where he talked about how much he disliked political parties and how much he wanted the United States to remain neutral. The foreign policy of neutrality became synonymous with Washington, as he did not want to make foreign alliances because he believed the fragile nation was not ready to make that type of commitment. During the New Republic time period after the Constitution, there are going to be factions known as the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. The Hamiltonians favor the Federalists. They favor the propertied, England in foreign policy. They like the national bank, a strong army, and a strong central government. They also favored the propertied in terms of who rules. As for the Jeffersonians, they favored the educated commoner, agriculture, states' rights, and France in foreign policy. The first political party election is going to be in 1796, where it's John Adams, the Federalist, against Thomas Jefferson, the Democratic Republican. John Adams is going to win the election, but he's only going to be a one-term president. During his time, he's going to deal with an undeclared war with France. That's because the French are upset because of the Jay Treaty, which was ratified during the Washington administration. In order to smooth things out with the French, we send over some diplomats to France, and they are immediately bribed in what's called the XYZ affair. John Adams will not pay tribute or money for these diplomats to meet with a Frenchman, so we have the undeclared war against France, also known as the Quasi-War. During that war, there are going to be some unpopular acts passed called the Alien and Sedition Acts. Collectively, you'll have 4 acts passed, but they are going to deport people, also limit free speech. Vice President Thomas Jefferson, along with James Madison, pushed back at the Alien and Sedition Acts, and collectively they wrote the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. They said that the states should be able to declare acts such as those null and void, which meant that the states would have more power than the federal government. This would be a debate that would continue on for decades. Adams leaves office because he loses the next election in the election of 1800. This election is a little complex. That's because Thomas Jefferson wound up tied with his soon-to-be vice president, Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr will not step aside during this election. However, the House of Representatives determined that Jefferson would indeed win. John Adams also loses this election, and he's done with politics. As for the Jefferson administration, you need to know that when he won, it was called the Revolution of 1800. It was the first time that the common man would be in control of the White House. Jefferson as president does not act like a Jeffersonian. He supports a stronger government. He uses loose interpretation of the Constitution so that he can purchase Louisiana from Napoleon. The United States will buy the entire Louisiana territory, not just New Orleans, for $15 million. This doubles the size of the nation. Lewis and Clark are sent out to explore this area, and eventually you will see a settling of the frontier. Jefferson supports the Navy during his presidency and even sends boats overseas to the Mediterranean in the Tripoli War. There's going to be a very controversial part of Jefferson's presidency, and it's called the Embargo Act. Jefferson supports this act that cuts off trade to Europe. It destroys the northern economy, and eventually it will be repealed. The purpose of the Embargo Act was to make sure that the United States remained neutral when it came to Europe, as they were fighting wars during this time. However, after it was repealed, Jefferson was basically finished politically, and James Madison becomes president. During Madison's presidency, the issue of impressment was of greatest importance. As seen in the 1807 Chesapeake Leopard affair, this is when British sailors for their navy hop onto American boats, kidnap people, and force them into the British Navy. It was quite unpopular in the United States and helped lead to the War of 1812.
The war was also caused by war hawks demanding more land from places such as Florida, which they wanted to take over, as well as nationalism and a desire to protect American manufacturing. Things didn't go great for the United States at first. Washington, D.C., that had just opened up, was burned, including the White House. However, the United States did fight back at the Battle of Fort McHenry. This is where Francis Scott Key wrote the poem that would become the national anthem. The Treaty of Ghent ended the war in 1814, and luckily for the United States, they did not lose any territory. It's important to note that during the War of 1812, the Federalist Party disappeared. They effectively died after the Hartford Convention, where they protested against Mr. Madison's war, but it didn't go anywhere. So you only have one political party, and that meant you have the era of good feelings, which wasn't so great because you have the Panic of 1819, as well as some other political infighting. Henry Clay had a very important system that you need to know about called the American system. His plan was to be self-sufficient in the United States. You didn't have to trade so much with Europe. You had enough resources here. That meant high tariffs, support for the national bank, as well as an internal improvements bill which never did get passed. Internal improvements meant to improve infrastructure such as roads as well as bridges. The United States would eventually purchase Florida in 1819 in the Adams-Onis Treaty from Spain. John Quincy Adams, whose name is in that treaty, would become the Secretary of State. As Secretary of State, he had one of the most important roles in the Monroe administration because he is the one who wrote up the Monroe Doctrine. After Spain left the New World because of independence movements in places such as Mexico, they wanted to come back in the 1820s and reclaim. However, the United States said with the Monroe Doctrine that European nations could not make new colonies in the Western Hemisphere. It was the first time the United States would make such a bold foreign policy statement. John Quincy Adams would eventually win the presidency in 1824, even though Andrew Jackson had both an electoral and popular vote lead. The election went to the House of Representatives, where Henry Clay, who had a lot of influence there, helped to get Quincy Adams chosen as the president. In return, Quincy Adams made Clay the Secretary of State. The event is known as the corrupt bargain, and Henry Clay always denied that it ever happened. During the New Republic, the Supreme Court gained a lot of power under Supreme Court Chief Justice John Marshall. You need to know about the 1803 court case of Marbury versus Madison. It's the first time that judicial review is used. That is when the Supreme Court reviews a federal law and determines if it is constitutional or not. Other John Marshall cases favored the federal government, such as Gibbons versus Ogden, which supported federal supremacy with interstate commerce. In addition, in the court case of McCulloch versus Maryland, the Supreme Court said that a state could not tax the federal government's national bank, and they said that implied powers, which is when the government uses the Constitution not exactly, but it is implied with the law of the Constitution that the United States can pass legislation, they said that that was fine in terms of creating the national bank.